Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Northcross. My name's Han. I'm one of the pastors here. If you've got your Bibles, would you please take them out and let's turn to Ruth chapter 1. Last week, we started a study through this book and did an overview of the entire book, all 4 chapters. Today, we're going to zoom in just on chapter 1. Now, the book of Judges, which is what we studied prior to this, it ends with the need for a king, and the book of Ruth shows how God provided a king. And even bigger than that, how God providentially cares for his people, not just at a national level, but at an individual level. And what happens in the book of Ruth, it starts the story by honing in on the family of Elimelech and Naomi and their sons Mahlon and Chilion. And you remember from last week, Elimelech means my God is king. Naomi means sweet. And then Mahlon and Chilion means sickly and crying. Just very briefly, you don't need to turn there. This is, we kind of hear that and go, that's very odd. But this is one of the ways that they named their kids back then. So that the child would be born and they'll look at the child and go, oh, okay, what's going on here, and kind of name accordingly. So in Genesis chapter 25, I'll just jump there. You don't need to go there. We read about Esau and Jacob and how they got their names. And this is just another example of, if you're curious about Mahlon and Chilion or why parents would name their children such, here's just an example of that happening. When her days to give birth were completed, behold, there were twins in her womb. The first came out red, all his body like a hairy cloak. So they called his name Esau, which means hairy. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob, which means he takes by the heel. So Mahlon and Chilion, I don't know if maybe they were born and like a baby does, is crying, or one is sickly, or maybe they were nicknames, but yeah, that's just an example of how people named their children back then. So anyway, it hones in on this family of Elimelech, and through this family's story, the scriptures tell us of God, a God who is sovereign, who rules over the world, even when it looks like he is not there. This book is teaching us about the providence of God, the sovereign care of God and how he rules. So with that in mind, today as we go through the text, I want to point out 3 things that God's sovereignty or his rule over our lives and the world, what that means for us. So let me start in chapter 1, verse 1. And Domia, if you can just chuck that map up again, please, and then we can kind of see what's going on. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other, Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Stop right there. The first point I want to make from those first 5 verses is because of the fact that God rules, we should trust and obey. That's our first point this morning. Because God rules over everything, we should trust and obey. So remember, this is during a time of rebellion. We looked at how they're going through a famine, which is indicative of the people in rebellion against God. And actually, Judges, they're just going through that cycle of rebelling against God. And in the Mosaic covenant, it was decreed that when people rebelled against God, that there would be curses, there would be judgment for that, one of which being a famine. And so they're during this time of rebellion, and this idea of evil days or rebellious days is even further emphasized here in verse 4 when it says that these took Moabite wives. Now you might wonder, hey, they're just looking for wives and they got married. What's the big deal? Why is this prohibited? Why is God against this? I want to read Deuteronomy. Again, you don't need to turn there. I'll turn to Deuteronomy chapter 7. In this passage, it doesn't actually name the Moabites specifically, but it's not an exhaustive list, I guess. This is God talking to his people. He says, "You shall not intermarry with them," talking about the neighboring nations, "giving your daughters to their sons or taking their daughters for your sons." So I'm saying this is a time of rebellion, and that the fact that they married Moabite women is even more emphasis of their rebellion. So what am I trying to say? Is God against interracial marriage? Is that what this is saying? And if that is the case, we should take note, because if God is against interracial marriage, well, I'm stuffed because my wife is not a Korean. She's from Brazil. So what is this text saying when it says, hey, don't marry the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites, and all of these things? Why is them marrying Moabite women a sign of rebellion? Well, it's got nothing to do with race per se. God is not against interracial marriage. If you continue reading in Deuteronomy chapter 7, it says, don't intermarry with them. Why? Because of the color of their skin? No. The reason for it is for they would turn away your sons from following me to serve other gods. So in Deuteronomy chapter 7, and here when we talk about why it was rebellion to marry these people, these Moabites, the prohibition isn't against interracial marriage. The prohibition is against interfaith marriage, because it's saying this is going to lead your sons or your daughters into spiritual departure. So it's nothing to do with race. Anyway, so Elimelech, his name means my God is king, but he does not live up to his name. He doesn't live in such a way to proclaim to the world that my God is king, because what he does is he moves his family to Moab. Now, we hear that, and it kind of makes sense, doesn't it? There's a famine here, so any good dad would, roll up his sleeves and say, okay, we got to do what we got to do, and got to provide for my family, right? So it just at a human level, it kind of makes sense to us. But if we think about the context of these people, Israel and Moab had a very interesting and tense relationship. So in Deuteronomy chapter 23, when God is talking about who can come into his assembly, he actually specifically mentions, hey, Moabites are not allowed to be here, to be part of the assembly. And there are many reasons for that. One of it, which is in Genesis chapter 19, we read about the complicated beginnings of the Moabites, which was, there's a guy called Lot, and he had these two daughters. And the two daughters thought, hey, there's no men around here. So they basically get their father really, really drunk and rape him and conceive and have children. And one of those children was Moab. And so that was the start of the Moabites. So there's already the sense of this kind of complicated, incestuous beginning to the people of Moab. But not only that, just throughout history, the Moabites and the Israelites had beef. So if you read through Numbers, you read about Balak, King Balak, and he's asking Balaam, the prophet Balaam, to, hey, can you curse Israel? Of course, he does the opposite. So there's already this kind of tension, and I think in Numbers 25 onwards, you read accounts of Moabite women who are seducing the Israelite men into sexual immorality and then into idolatry to worship their gods. Actually, even Judges itself, in Judges chapter 3, we read about how the Moabites, King Eglon, he ruled over the Israelites for 18 years. So, okay, we're seeing this until God raised up Ehud to kind of liberate them. So there's this really complicated relationship with the Moabites. And not only that, the Moabites worshipped a deity called Chemosh. And part of the worship of Chemosh, as with many nations around there, was child sacrifice. that they would sacrifice their own kids. Actually, King Mesha in 2 Kings, he's losing a battle. So this is the king, he's losing a military battle, and he goes, oh, what should I do to win this battle? Oh, I'll sacrifice my firstborn son. Like the heir to my throne, I'll kill him in order to win. So this is the kind of people that they were, which, by the way, understanding that the nations around them, around Israel, were all into child sacrifices. That's actually very helpful to know that, because it helps us understand kind of things that happen in the early days of Israel. So like, when you think about accounts in the Bible of, hey, why don't you take your son to the top of that hill and then sacrifice him, kill him for me? Right? We read that and go, well, what is God playing at with that? And then obviously God says, hey, no, like, don't actually kill your son. I've prepared an animal for you to. That is actually not just an interesting story of like, whoa, God did something kind of funny there, like he pulled a prank on him. That's actually theological messaging to say like, hey, Yahweh, like this is what you would expect from all the gods around you, from Chemosh and Molech and Baal and all these things, but it's actually making a statement about who Yahweh is. No, Yahweh is not like the other gods. He's different. We don't kill our children for him. Anyway, that was just a side note. Anyway, so this is who the Moabites were. They worshiped these deities. They were like this. And so if you think about Elimelech, my God is king, for him to be leaving the chosen land that God has specifically, it wasn't arbitrary. God said, like, this is the land. This is for you. For him to leave that specifically given land of milk and honey to go to Moab, not just anywhere, but go to Moab, where people like this, that's supposed to be a big deal. So this is why we're talking about, like, man, this is a time of rebellion. This would be, I don't know what the equivalent would be, but it'd be kind of like if you lived in New Zealand's land of milk and honey, the chosen land of Browns Bay, and you left the beautiful shores of Browns Bay to go to... I'm scanning the room to see who I'm going to offend. Hamilton. We go, what are you playing at? Why would you leave Browns Bay to... okay, I'm being facetious, but you get the idea of, like, this is the chosen land. This is what God has given you. Why would you leave this for that? And of all the places, Moab, why would you do that? So I guess, really what's happening here is, this is why our point is, because God rules over all, our duty is to trust and obey. Yes, it makes sense, Elimelech, your family's hungry, you're going to go uproot them and get them out of here to go to a different place. But God had spoken. God had chosen this land for this people, and so what they should have done is they should have stayed. No, there's no food here, but has God fed his people when they were hungry before? Yes, he has. Has God come through for his people in the past? Yes, he has. Every time we repent and turn back to him, does he come through? Yes, he does. So what they should have done is to trust God and obey him and say, we're going to stay here, we're going to repent, and we're going to seek God's will. And so the idea is for him, and I guess for us, is to trust God when he has spoken, even when it seems foolish to the world. You see, to the rest of the world, they would have been like, no, if you're hungry, get out of here. Go to Moab. Go find yourself some Moabite wives. But when God has spoken, when God has called, our duty is to trust and obey, even if it doesn't make sense to everyone else, even if it seems foolish to the rest of the world. The call for us as Christians is we should trust God over pragmatism, what seems to make sense in the eyes of the world. You think about in Daniel chapter 3, when they make this golden statue or this golden image, and they say, hey, whenever you hear that horn blowing, you got to stop what you're doing and go worship this idol. And that was the law. And if you don't, you're going to get chucked into the fire. And so, pragmatically, it makes sense. Hey, you're you're at work sending some emails, you hear the horn, oh, okay, I better worship that idol. Makes sense. Otherwise, you're going to get chucked into the fire. It makes sense to be pragmatic, but what do Daniel's mates say? Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They say, no, we're not going to do that. We're not going to bow down to your idols. And so they're choosing to trust and obey God, even when it seems pragmatic and it makes sense to the world to follow along. And there might be so many examples of this in our own lives. And it might be something like, I'm going to turn down this promotion at work because if I take that job, then I'll have no time for my family. Or I'll have to move from here when I know that God has called me here. Or that's going to force me to do some unethical things which goes against my faith. Maybe there are things in the culture that your workplace or your schools or wherever it might be is actually forcing you to give into that culture and agree with what's going on. And it makes sense to just quietly go along with it. But if God has spoken, our call is to trust and obey. Maybe it's ending a relationship. Maybe it's prioritizing church. Sunday is a great day to sleep in and then go to the beach or do some tidying at home or whatever it might be. And to the rest of the world is, oh man, you're so busy. Why don't you just take Sundays off to do your laundry or to go sailing or whatever it might be? But we go, no, I'm going to prioritize church and gather with his people to worship God together. And so my point is, whatever the situation might be, it might be difficult, it might be good, it might be hard, it might be whatever it is. If God has spoken, and he has, if God has spoken, our responsibility is to trust and obey. Because apparently there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. The second point I'd like us to see from this text, as it relates to God ruling over everything, is the fact that because God rules, our decisions are significant. Because this God rules over all, our decisions are significant. Look at verse 6. Follow along with me, it's a big chunk. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab. For she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So there's a genuine friendship here. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. Just one quick point on that. I legitimately cannot tell you how many times I've read through Ruth in the last, since we finished Judges. I say it's probably like almost getting into like the hundreds. I said last week that the narrator doesn't mention God, but he or she, probably he, actually does. So that's my mistake. Sorry about that. And I didn't realize it until I was reading it 3 days ago. Just reading the same Bible, the same text over and over. And I don't know how I missed it every other time. But the narrator does mention God. So that's just a clear up. So that just goes to show, hey, make sure you got your Bible in front of you, because this guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Anyway, what Ruth has done, Ruth has counted the cost. Naomi has said, hey, if you come with me, not only are you going to be a woman in a patriarchal society, not only are you going to be a widow, not only are you going to be a foreigner, but you're going to be a foreigner from Moab. This is not going to be good for you. Go back to your own mother's house, and life will be a lot easier for you there. But she has counted the cost. She said, no, I'm choosing to go with you. I'm going to cleave to you. That's the language. I'm going to be loyal to you, and I'm going to be loyal to your God. This is a moment of conversion. By the way, this is just a great picture of, I guess, Christian charity or Christian mercy, when it's like, Ruth has every right to say, yeah, you know what? Like Orpah, she gets a hard time when people preach on this. They'll be like, don't be like Orpah. She ditches her mother-in-law, da-da. But it makes sense. She did the pragmatic thing. And so it would have made total sense for Ruth to go, you know what, Naomi, you're actually right. I love you and I want to help you, but it does make sense. I probably should just go back to my mother's home. It totally would have made sense. But this, what we see here is a great picture of like what Christian agape love looks like of, man, I'm going to choose to love you even at a great cost to myself. That's what Christian love is, isn't it? Anyway, so this seemingly, it's a momentous occasion, but in the grand scheme of the universe, the seemingly small act was actually a very big deal. It's a very big deal that in the middle of nowhere, this random Moabite widow says, I'm going to stick with you, Naomi, and follow you to your homeland. Random decision, but a decision nonetheless that had massive, ginormous, gigantic ripple effects that impacted you and I personally. Because, Morne, you would not be sitting here this morning if not for this woman's decision to follow her mother-in-law. None of us would be here today if this Moabite widow had chosen to follow after Orpah and say, yep, I'll go back to my mother's home. You see, this one small, seemingly small, insignificant decision in the grand scheme of the world, 3,000 odd years ago, had a massive impact because, as we heard last week and as we know from the rest of the book, was this decision from Ruth to continue with Naomi and to become a follower of Yahweh. That decision meant that Jesus Christ was born. One small decision. The application I think that has for us is that our decisions today can have generational impact and ripple effects. The decisions we make today can have generational effects. I was at a wedding yesterday, and I was sat next to someone, and I was asking him about his family and what his relationship is like with his parents and siblings and whatnot. And he told me the story of how, and I have his permission to share this, and he told me about how his father was an alcoholic and was an abuser, and how that had a generational curse on the rest of the family. And so the natural kind of progression of the members of their family, he said something like he's one of the only guys in his family who hasn't ended up in jail. And the woman all got pregnant early, and these kind of things. And it was only by the grace of God that he got saved, and that generational curse, as it were, was broken with him. And he's a wonderful man, a great family. They minister in this church. But it just goes to show the decisions that we make today can have generational effects and impacts. And so as I was thinking about this, I thought, okay, if we are parents, we probably pray for our children, and I pray for my kids. But then I was challenged thinking, do I pray for my grandchildren that my kids are 6, 4, and 2. But am I praying for the grandchildren? Am I praying for the husbands that, God willing, my children will meet one day? And just thinking more generationally than just my surroundings. And I guess the impact of that is, what are the decisions that I'm making in my life now? What are the things that we're setting up in our lives now that are going to have generational impacts on our children and our grandchildren? And if I want to see my grandchildren follow Jesus, what do I do today with my children to make that happen? I think there's a challenge there for all of us, and whether it's related to children or the kind of life that we want to have in 20 years' time or whatever it might be. Because our lives are in the hands of a sovereign God who rules over all, we can trust that when we put in the hard work, as it were, and decide, I'm going to prioritize this in my family, or do this or do that God can actually bless that. He's not a God who is far removed. He's not a God who is unable and I wish I could help you with that, but sorry, my hands are tied. No. Because God rules, because God is sovereign and he rules over all, we can trust that our decisions, like we see here in this text, with this woman making this one small decision, we can trust that the God who rules will bless us and is faithful, and that our decisions will make a difference. Now, some of you might say, okay, well, if God is sovereign and he rules over all, then doesn't that mean my decisions don't matter? Because if God's going to do what God's going to do, then why does it matter what I do? And I like to think of it like this. I'm sure God will get his way. God will get his way. God's going to do what he's going to do. But our obedience and our trust of God is choosing whether we will have the joy in participating in his will. God has deemed that he will do this, and the only question is, will I have the joy of participating in God's plan or not? I think we see this so well in Esther. In Esther chapter 4, we read this, it's that bit about, for such a time as this. But actually before that, what's actually said before that is, hey, Esther, if you don't step up now, someone else is going to come save us. Deliverance for us is going to come from somewhere else. So it's like recognizing that actually God's going to come through. He's going to save us. But maybe you've been put here for such a time as this so that you and your family will survive too. Does that make sense? So it's understanding. God's going to get, deliverance for the Jews is going to come, whether it's through you, Esther, or whether it's through someone else. And so our obedience and our trust in God is just, okay, do I get the joy of participating in that or not? So, as we live our lives, as we make decisions, as we think about the kind of lives and the futures that we want, the encouragement for us is, because God rules over all, we can and should be thinking, okay, my decisions are important and I want to trust God with them. The final point I'd like us to see from this passage is that because God rules, because he rules over all, there is always hope. There's always hope because this God rules. Verse 19, so the two of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, is this Naomi? She said to them, don't call me Naomi, don't call me sweet. Call me Mara, which means bitter. For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, one of the things I want us to recognize, and just in that little passage there, is that Naomi's theology is actually pretty good. It's more or less, it's pretty good. she recognizes the sovereignty of God. You notice in all the things when they say, hey, is that Naomi? Is that sweetie? Don't call me sweet, call me bitter. Why call me bitter? Because God has done this. God has done this. God has done this. And so in her theology, she recognizes the sovereignty of God, it seems. She seems to understand that God is the one that rules over her calamity, but however, she falls short just at the end because she says, the sovereignty of God and God ruling over my calamity is causing me to be Mara, is causing me to be bitter. That's where she falls short. What I'm trying to say, and I think what this text tells us, is that because God is sovereign, because God rules, even though it hurts, and even though it might be terrible, like in her situation, because God rules, there should always be hope. And so a perfect theological statement from her would have been, God has done this, God has brought this calamity upon me, but because it is this God who is ruling over my calamity, call me hope. Don't call me sweet. Don't call me bitter. You can call me hope. Because the God who rules over her calamity is the God who is wise, who is good, who is loving, who is caring. He's a good father who cares for his children. And so even though it might look bleak, we can trust him. It's like Job when he says to his friends, though he slay me, yet I will hope in him, yet I will trust in him. It's amazing. Like the Psalms, we read about why are you downcast, O my soul? Why are you downcast? Why are you at turmoil within me? And then he switches that and goes, actually, but hope in God. I will hope in God and praise him and for my salvation. That's the perfect theology. And this text actually even suggests that hope. You might be wondering, what has this got to do with hope? If you look at the end of chapter 1 in verse 22, the author is actually introducing hope right here, because remember, they left with a famine, and it says here, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So there's a glimmer of hope being introduced. And actually in chapter 2, verse 1, so right after this, where there's almost like a parenthetical statement of, hey, by the way, there's this guy called Boaz, look out for him. And so the end of chapter 1 and the start of chapter 2 are both actually signals of hope. You were in a famine, but now you're coming into the barley harvest. And not only that, but there's this guy called Boaz who's going to be a redeemer for you. It's almost like a spoiler alert there. Now, of course, it's very easy to over-spiritualize this and I guess kind of simplify it, because if you think about her life, I can't even begin to imagine what it must be like to lose your husband and your 2 kids. I can't fathom that. And so for her to come back with this struggle and to almost kind of be mad and angry at God, I guess you could say it makes sense. I don't know how I would respond if I lost my wife and 3 kids. We'd all like to think that we would have the perfect theology, and at their funeral I would say, don't call me Mara, call me Hope. I'm sure we'd all like to think we'd do that, but I don't know. We would understand anyone who's kind of angry or demanding answers, as it were, and kind of bitter like she is. So please don't misunderstand. What I'm not trying to say is when someone is going through a hard time, that we should just over-spiritualize and go, oh, no, you're a Christian. You should be more hopeful. Stop being bitter. Be more hopeful. That's not what I'm saying. That's not how we should minister to people and to our friends. All I'm trying to say is that this is who God is, okay? And we should learn this theology now for ourselves, so that when we go into calamity and hard times, as hard as it might be, at the very least, we know the truth. It might be hard to live out, it might be hard to convince ourselves, but at the very least, we know in our own hearts, okay, if this is the God who is sovereign over my pain and my struggles, then at the very least, mentally, I know that there is hope. It's just so that we can have the good, strong, solid theology to hold on to when hard times come. And so this morning, as we eat this bread and drink this juice, it's a physical, tangible, literal reminder of our God. That God, despite our sin and our rebellion against him, that he stepped into time, into this world, in the person of Jesus Christ, lived a perfectly righteous life, died a criminal's death as our substitute, raised from the dead, and anyone who places their trust in him, anyone that says, I can't save myself, God, I need you to save me, I need your provision of salvation. Well, this is a reminder of that. The Bible tells us that the bread is symbolic of his body breaking, the juice is symbolic of his blood being poured out to secure the new covenant where we can have a relationship with God simply by grace through faith in Jesus Christ. And it's a reminder that God, this God, is sovereign over our lives and that we can trust him. And so this morning, if you are a Christian, if you have turned away from yourself and your sin and said, I need Jesus Christ for my salvation, if you have trusted in him, then this meal is for you. If that does not apply to you, then we just respectfully ask that you pass it on. It doesn't have to be a big thing, just because it's a tangible reminder of what God has done for us in Jesus Christ. So as the communion team come forward, would you please pray with me?